Okay, so now we're going to have discussion, and once again, I'm going to ask people to come to the microphones to ask their questions, and the person you haven't seen yet is Jennifer Manley, and she's sitting right next to Randy Engel. Jennifer, could you raise your hand? Okay. So that's Dr. Yaakov Stern, who's best known for introducing the concept of cognitive reserve, and he's sitting in for Dr. Manley. Okay, open for questions. Okay, I've got a question.
That's what happens when you stand between people in their afternoon drink, right?
So my question is for Dr. Stern. Education is something that you've been a co-author on a paper looking at French of higher and lower education and effects on cognitive aging, and it does show a positive effect. Very recently, Laura Zahadny is co-author on a paper in which education does not show a beneficial effect. So I'm very interested in why we get these inconsistencies in something like education that we normally think of as always positive.
So the question is about education and rate of cognitive decline in normal aging. And yeah, there's been a lot of early studies, including some of our own, suggested that there was an effect of education on rate. And using some of the more modern psychometric techniques, people didn't find those. Laura had a paper where she didn't find it, but the truth is that then she took this Washington Heights cohort. I'll show it tomorrow. She took the Washington Heights cohort and analyzed those data using good growth curve models and did find an effect of education on rate. So my guess is that it's really, again, the same story. It depends on exactly what the range of education is. So in the two studies that I know Laura did, in the first study was the Victoria longitudinal aging cohort, minimum education was 12 years. Washington Heights study, we have a range of 2 to 16 years. It could be the amount of people. There's just so many variables that come into it. So I haven't reviewed all the papers, but there's enough of them around that I find that if you tweak it right, at least in enough populations, you do see the effect.
Okay, please identify yourself.
Yes, hello. Eleanor Sayegh Haddad, Bar-Ilan University. I have a question to Harold Klassen about morphological processing. It relates to the modulation of age of acquisition on inflectional priming. First of all, why do you think this is so? And do you think that this difference in the derivational versus inflectional priming reflects the genuine differences between the inflectional and the derivational systems, or the distributional differences in the distributional properties of these different morphological structures? And the second question is, to what extent do you think that you are going to find similar findings when you look at processing, and especially conscious processing, as we see in morphological awareness tasks, for instance?
All right. Okay. So your first question was, what's the reason for this rather subtle contrast that we found in this age of acquisition effect? Why is it that there were no age of acquisition effects in derivation, but there were some in inflection, right? We hinted at a linguistic source for this difference, in the sense that the products of derivation, even though they consist of internal structure, a stem and an ending, can be stored as separate words. They form separate words that are units of storage. But inflected forms are, from that perspective, not units of storage. They are just spell-outs of features. right? That is the linguistic difference that we were relying on. And our speculation was that perhaps there is a critical period for the acquisition of inflectional roles, of these purely grammatical inflectional roles, and that the older you get, or the later you start, these rules get, these representations that these rules create get less and less stable. And then you get indirectly this difference in the priming effects, okay? Now, that was of course this is a speculative story, but it aligns with findings that we get, not only we, but other people as well, when you look at late bilinguals, where you find relatively consistent priming for derivation, but not for inflections, right? And the general message, I think, from this talk was that one can identify interesting contrasts, you know, for example, age of acquisition effects, when one moves away from just looking at global measures of language. That was the main point, actually. Now, your second question was, sorry for this long answer, but you asked two questions. Your second question was, what about other more conscious tasks? Would you find the same pattern? No, I mean, if we just change the task from masked to overt priming, then we see different patterns, right? So it's like a very specific mechanism that we were tapping into. So it's not only the linguistics that is specific, but it's also the processing mechanism that's very specific, right? So the difference, we haven't done this for age of acquisition, but we have done this with late bilinguals, and this very sharp contrast disappears when we look at overt priming experiments. Sorry.
Please identify yourself.
Yeah. This is Julia Hershenson from the University of Washington. I was thinking that the first two presentations both dealt with immigrants, and they were very different sorts of studies, but both sets, and I wasn't really sure about the Turkish-German bilinguals, but it seemed that the education level, to bring this back to the penultimate question, was not exceedingly high for the Spanish-English bilinguals in Washington Heights. Was it really 5 versus 8 years for the bilinguals had 8 years education versus 5 for the monolinguals?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I wondered if that doesn't seem, it's certainly more objective, if you want, and with the thousands of subjects that they had. But on the other hand, it didn't seem to be representative it wasn't like the self-selecting, really highly educated subjects who might have been, you know, in another study. But on the other hand, it seems like maybe it was too low. And I wondered also about the German-Turkish bilinguals and what their level of education was. And I saw there's a big range from those who were born in Germany to those who emigrated at 38.
So I can answer first about the Washington Heights study. Yeah, the Hispanic population, especially the earlier cohorts, they're mainly from Dominican Republic, and the mean education rate levels are really quite low in that group. Now, not all, the people extend up until much later, much higher education. But yeah, so you could argue that here's a situation where perhaps these people can't benefit from being bilingual because they have low education. I don't know if that's logical, but that's an argument that one might make.
Can I jump in and say, when I listened to her paper on the plane on the way up, it struck me that she talks about is it Golan paper?
Golan, yeah.
Where the lower educational ones were the ones who showed the benefit, right? So one argument would be that this group should be most likely to show that benefit as opposed to higher.
Just one sentence about the German Turkish bilinguals. The smallest subset in our group were these classical immigrants, late bilinguals. The largest number of people in our sample were people that were born in Germany and went through the German schooling system, and so they were not disadvantaged more than other people. And in any case, that doesn't explain the contrast between derivation and inflection.
I'm still Ellen Bialystok. My
Franco's still dead.
my question is for Jennifer Yakov. First, a comment on one of the early slides where you, I don't know if it was you or it was Jennifer, but I have to speak to you about this, listed a summary of the studies. It was really quite incomplete. There are 3 studies immediately that come to mind that are incidence studies showing later on lower cumulative risk in bilinguals. And there's a very important 62-year longitudinal study on cognition by Thomas Bach and his colleagues. So the profile of the literature could have been fleshed out a bit more and it wouldn't have looked quite so stark. But that's not my question. I'm really interested in the Washington Heights study. I think it's a tremendously interesting cohort and very interesting complex data. But there's a couple of issues around it that I find difficult. Now, the first one is about how these groups are labeled. We were talking this morning about whether or not Virginia's ability to order a fabulous meal in French has done anything to change her cognitive system. And we discussed in the period after the presentations about these questions of how bilingual you have to be. And I think what Judy Kroll explained is that it begins changing right away, although those effects aren't seen. Now, who are the monolinguals in this study? They're Spanish-speaking people who have lived in a very Spanish-speaking neighborhood, I grant you that, for at least 23 years in New York City. So they may not feel that they speak English. They may be insecure about reporting that they speak English, but I submit they are not monolingual. So the question I have is about that graph in panel D. Now you flashed it, but I know it, so I can comment on what would not have been seen without closer scrutiny. All 4 of the curves reported in that study show very clear dissociation of risk by the factor. The largest one is age. The older you were when you were recruited, the greater the chance you're going to fall off the cliff. Takes a huge portion of the variance because the recruitment ages are so vastly different. You see it for education, see it for gender. The interesting thing is, having accounted for all that, we move to panel D. And you said, which is statistically correct, that there is no significant effect. However, the stratification of those lines was exactly in order of level of bilingualism, exactly. So what we have is a statistical effect where what we're really comparing, I think, is effect size, not theoretical presence or absence of effect, but differences in effect size. And I think we can all think of lots of reasons why the effect sizes are different for those factors. So I think this study is so interesting because you also report that on these other measures of control and so forth, the bilinguals, the ones you're calling bilingual, really doing better. So what would be your reaction to that in terms of the ordering of the lines in light of the absence of a conventional statistical difference in those lines?
You see that a lot. I mean, the fact is that after you control for the rest of the variables, there was no significant effect. So you could argue a lot of ways. Wow, maybe if the age disparities weren't so great or the educational disparities weren't so great, you wouldn't find the effect. You would find the effect, but the fact is that it wasn't there. And there also wasn't a disparity in the rate of decline. You could argue that the bilinguals that were included in this study or the monolinguals weren't really bilingual or monolingual. In this study, the effect wasn't found. I think my thought and Jennifer's thought, I mean, I went through the same thing a long time ago. A long time ago, we started to report that there was disparities in the risk of developing dementias as a function of education. And when there were one study or there were two studies, people had different results. You know, and after 20 or 30 studies, things started to clarify themselves. So if the studies are done right, using incident cases, I really can't trust any study that just looks at people's self-ratings of when they got demented or some estimate, because we know they're not accurate. But it's a question of, as the epidemiologic evidence accrues, we'll see. You know, it's just a matter of time because everyone's very interested in the concept, and we'll see what happens. You know, and if the evidence is there, if the effect is there, the evidence will come out.
I have a follow-up question about that.
Yeah.
Panel D is not controlling for age, gender,
Right.
et cetera, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Not residual.
Sorry?
It's just a pure effect without
Right.
control.
Just pure.
Right.
But it was fairly close to ceiling, as I recall. That's the other thing, is that, you know, those lines, when I looked at it, were pretty close. But, you know, the bottom line is, what accounts for dementia?
Use the microphone.
You know, the issue is what accounts for the bulk of the variance in dementia. And in this study, it wasn't bilingualism.
Right.
That's the
You know,
issue.
and look, there's so many types of bilingualism and different types, different places when they're acquired, how old the people are, when they acquire these languages, the educational attainment. I think that there's just so many variables, it's going to take a lot of studies to ferret it out.
Sure. Well, I was thinking whether I should kind of participate in discussion, because in a way, I feel like my talk tomorrow is exactly addressing all these questions. I was speaking about immigration, we were speaking about education, I was speaking about reverse causality and so on. So I hope if some of you are still there, I will address it in detail. But I have just one question. So have I understood correctly that people entered the Washington Heights study when they were 65?
Right.
Okay, that means that already you would not get people who got dementia before that. And in fact, I mean, early onset dementia is not that rare. And interestingly, what we have shown in Hyderabad study is that the dementia where we had the biggest difference between bilinguals and monolinguals was the frontotemporal dementia, which has a younger age of presentation. So from this point of view, it could also be that basically people who would have already demented simply didn't enter the study. Because one of the things I find very interesting is, and what you showed is, I mean, the lines go exactly parallel down, so it's very similar to education effect, exactly as you pointed out, which some studies will show effect, some studies will not, but I think we all believe that there is probably an effect of intercept, so that could explain why you don't see that much interesting change.
I'd say that in the Washington Heights study, you're right, frontotemporal dementia is very rare. Almost all of the dementia that we're showing there is Alzheimer's disease. You know, frontotemporal dementia is a whole different story than Alzheimer's dementia.
Identify yourself.
Lynn Hasher. I actually am interested in the potential role that stress plays in these studies. So you may know about Eldar Shafir's work showing the impact of stress particularly on poor people. Also raising an issue of the impact of stress on immigrants in societies where the immigrants are not, I don't know what the right term would be, not greeted with joy, let us say. And so I just was wondering the degree to which this issue of stress and its effect, so we know also from physiological work that stress takes a hit on the hippocampus, and a lifetime of stress takes a really big hit on the hippocampus. So whether this issue of stress has played a role in these studies. So the Washington Heights people are clearly not living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where lots of rich people live. they are largely poor and working class, lower income people, so more likely to be subjected to stress, I guess. Somebody once accused me of having terrible values based on saying
But
something
I'm not sure what your point is.
Well, my question is, so you've been looking at education, and I just was wondering whether stress was a measure that anybody had used in any of these studies, your study, Thomas's studies.
Yeah, we don't have, you're correct that we do not have formal measures of stress in this group. But I think the Washington Heights community is much more heterogeneous than you might imagine. You know, the little subset that you caught a view of today is the Hispanic group. We have people ranging from 2 years of education to PhDs, people of all levels of socioeconomic status. And actually, it's at this point, I mean, when we first started, it was a rough community, but still had very strong pockets of higher SES people. At this point, it's a very stable, middle class, primarily on the Hispanic level, Dominican community, very, very politically savvy, nice community.
The data we saw today was just on people who had a maximum of 8 years of education.
No, that's not a maximum mean.
Oh, that was,
Yeah. But I mean, look, I think you're right that there's so many, whenever you work with any cohort study, there's so many variables. I mean, and we've been fooled over and over again with very well-formed epidemiologic studies. Whether you believe the estrogen story or not, to me, that's the classic example where study after study showed a very good studies, and ours as well, showed protective effects of estrogen. But when people brought that to the test of controlled trials, it just didn't work. You could argue that the controlled trials were wrong and that they could have done it differently and maybe found something. But, you know, anytime you're doing epidemiologic studies like these, there could always be some other reason for what you're seeing that's undetected.
You have a question there?
Thank you. She's ahead of me.
Oh, okay, fine.
Still Ken Papp. One of my professors at the University of Wisconsin was Dr. Chapman, and Miller and Chapman wrote an article in, I think it was 2001, indicating that the use of covariates that are confounded with the grouping variable is inappropriate. And similar statements are in the textbook that I'm using to teach statistics. And so I've raised this issue a lot with concern, and we saw a couple cases of it today. Is it age of acquisition or L2 proficiency? Right. It's fairly common practice to try to statistically control for these other factors that are actually confounds. And clearly in the limiting case, they can't do it. If Miller and Chapman are correct, even in rather moderate cases of correlation across the grouping variable, we shouldn't be trusting this methodology. And given that this is a methodology panel, I toss it to you to give me advice.
Ken, I think that's absolutely correct, and it's something that we deal with all of the time. I mean, you know, in my lab, we test a lot of people from the community in Atlanta, along with students from Georgia Tech and Emory and so forth. And, you know, it's confounding a variety of things. You know, when I get community people, so who's available to come to a university to do a 2-hour study in the middle of the day? And it's probably somebody that's unemployed. Probably their race effects, there are all kind of things. And you know, and I'll occasionally have students say, well, we covary this. You know, you just can't, these things are confounded, which is what you're saying. And you can lie to people by doing that, and I just choose not to. What we try to do is to look at effects within a group. So if you look at all of those people who come in who are unemployed, do you still see a relationship that looks like, you know, at one end of the scale? Do you see a pattern that looks like what you would see for the full range? That's about as close, I think, as we can come. But if the point you're making is that analysis of covariance can be used badly, I certainly couldn't disagree with that.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you see it, I think the more egregious examples are in smaller studies where you'll have huge disparities between these groups. Covariating out assumes that there's some linear effect that you can get rid of, and it just doesn't work. Epi studies are complex. Epi studies are, the Washington Heights study in total has over 4,000 people that have been followed. And there's huge disparities, and when you want to address some specific question, you do the best you can. You can do subgroup analyses, sensitivity analyses, but in the end, you don't know the directionality of any of these relationships, and there could be some external variable that's causing all of it. That's why I think, I used to be a little shocked. I'm not an epidemiologist by training, I'm a neuropsychologist, and why epidemiologists felt they had to replicate these kinds of findings over and over again in multiple populations. And it's not like cloning a gene. You have to identify these effects in multiple populations because you could still be wrong. You just need to be convinced that what you're seeing is really true.
I think we have time for one more question. Thank you.
Thanks. My question is to the first set of presenters.
Say who you are.
Alaka Blackwell, Middle Tennessee State University. So I'm interested in how you control when it comes to the morphological tasks in terms of frequency and also not just frequency, but also productivity. So I'm thinking obviously for the inflectional morphemes, even though I don't speak German, so you can correct me on this, I'm assuming that in that particular case where you have the past participle ending, it applies across the verb class, whereas possibly the deverbal nominalization one does not necessarily apply equally across the verb class. So there must be some frequency effects there as well. So since we've been speaking about methodological issues and you go into great pains to make sure that you're controlling for the participants' exposure to German, I'm just wondering then we often compare apples and oranges when it comes to inflectional morphology, which has a finite set of morphemes, and derivational morphology, which is much larger. Your thoughts about that, your thoughts about that aspect of the methodology of a project like this?
Okay. No, I mean, the point was that we were not just trying to be careful about the participant level factors, but also about the design and trying to match the items as closely as we can. The items were matched for frequency. The items that we used in the experiment were matched for frequency, for word form frequency, for stem frequency, etc. As for length, the primes were matched for length, for all sorts of parameters that are thought to be relevant in that literature. There was one point that was unavoidable, that was not ideal. In that, and Joao talked about this point, in that the prime and the derivational condition overlapped at the beginning of the word. Whereas in the inflectional condition, we had this overlap towards the end of the word. But for that, we created overlap control conditions. So we really did as best as we can to match them for all these parameters that are thought to be relevant in that literature. But the main point was that in contrast to previous studies in this domain that compared inflection and derivation, where two experiments were done, one with inflected forms and the other with derived forms with different targets, this was priming towards the same target, once from an inflected form and once from a derived form. That was the point that we thought was kind of interesting.
Okay, so now we have a coffee break and a poster session, and we start again tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Let's thank our speakers. Good session.
Is okay?
I'm good.
Yeah, thank you. Wow. Okay, very good.
Yes. Go have some coffee. Well,
Putting a man on board.
Hello, I'm Albert Costa.
oh,
Hi,
oh,
finally.
we've been walking to each other, right?
Well, thank you for organizing this.
Oh, thank you for sending out an invitation.
I'm learning a lot. It was the right moment to organize it, so.
Have the slides?
I had them, yes, and I have a video actually, so I want to check.
Let's see. You know, actually, I need to speak.
So I wonder.
How are you?
Or are they still developing their?
A veure, aquest dibuix és d'una cuina. Veig una senyora que està netejant la cuina, els plats i...
These.
A veure, aquest dibuix és d'una cuina. Veig una senyora que està netejant la cuina, els plats y els estris de la cuina. A la izquierda hay dos niños. Uno está subido a un taburete, el otro...
But you would have priming it at 6. Then we stand already at 0 minutes. When you start learning the language, 20, 30, then you have about 50 minutes.
Yeah, how do you do that? That's so interesting.
Straightforward explanation is simply that's
A veure aquest dibuix, em sembla que...
That's why we're competing even more. So what we're trying to
Yes.
That is a bit strange. Strange, and I think we're more So what's going on? Look at everything. The point is this is something like when you don't find the effect, or could it be that this innovation thing is actually showing up every now and then, but we simply don't have enough power to detect it. And another thing is that in studies usually if people don't have no, I'm just starting to learn about it. Yeah. So you have certain cohorts that are just around this limited age. And when I looked at all this studies,
So the whole thing about stress there's a lot of evidence to suggest
I'll probably get you a new one. Out of 14, there's susceptibility. So this seems to be something that shows up in very small effects of 10 millisecond inhibition, things like that. This appears over and over again. It's really just a sampling thing. It's just a variation. It doesn't mean anything.
So twins back at home, that's all. So it could be that.
Yes, and then what we do when we get people from we just get a group of people. And on average, they are showing innovation. On average, they are showing innovation. I just grabbed a group of people that is not significant. So what is significant in this analysis is that the points I actually grabbed say just the 30 people that learn the language very late, they're showing inhibition numerically. This is significant. So we don't really know what's going on there. We think that there is a competition interferences. Actually think that this might be restricted when you actually do later. When you actually use priming tests, they're not must priming.
So I didn't realize this.
Then I think things might facilitate the change. Because you also have the same semantics, etc. So we have all sorts of other things. At this early access, our results suggest to me that things are kind of almost only open the right of the letters. You open more easily if you have enough.
Just to...
Okay,
sure. Yeah, because I didn't know
maybe that you need to target links.
Yeah.
And that's why under the time that we have shown the graph.
Ready? Yeah, but...
I'm writing it now.
Okay.
So maybe you'll hear about it in a second.
facilities take care of that.
Yes, she's actually with us now.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
in Putney.
Yeah, she is a professor in our program. Take the courses, yeah.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
And,
There we go.
There we go. So
Yeah.
Studies.
Yeah, Dr. Moore was very honored.
But that suggests to me that some of what we're seeing is actually.
I have already. Yeah, I mean.
It should be visual, so we could simply just increase the drive duration.
Somebody the prime minister when they're
we're
of the same length and size to be inhibition. But anyway, I worked on the compound project and I found substantial facilitation.
What time is
My compound are much longer. And then my targets are much shorter. I don't know. So, well, this is from a class that I took with a professor. So he suggested, to the point that when the prime and the target are of a similar length, then inhibition. I'm not.
Presentation.
Oh. Yeah. Exactly. That's it. Exactly. Given the circumstances.
When I saw this inhibition, I thought, oh, this is this kind of orthographic effect. So for instance, hard, inhibit, cause, or whatever.
There are many words
They facilitate because they share letters, but then it seems that they inhibit as well.
Yeah.
And if they have a lot of similar neighbors, if these neighbors are high frequency, then you get more inhibition. Because the primes activates all these neighbors, and all these neighbors are
Right. I remember Dr. Gordon. Dr. Gordon, I think, yeah. Right? Oh.
Exactly, that's it.
Yeah.
So it's like if the prime is a neighbor of the target, you have facilitation. But then if there are other neighbors that are neighbors of the prime and the target, they're also being activated, and then that's something that and I thought when I saw this inhibition, I thought, and because of the orthographic they're inhibiting each other. Then the orthographic control conditions are.
So I'm just thinking about my study.
No problem. For later ages of acquisition, actually, but none of this. We don't really know. That could explain the morphological.
Which one is it?
But you saw
And to me, it's the stress chemical.
So is there processing? I don't know.
Willing to.
Also strange. So like you said, instead of it being like that,
I was thinking about.
which means that
Who's going in?
it's not like all these helpful learners are alike.
And
Exactly.
It means that you learn later.
so I just was saying, she's just saying,
You show different places people learn.
If you want the other if you want to see everybody else's because you're I was thinking about that. They can process, if it's not the law too. Right. Like they can't just process. Right. Exactly. But I was even thinking about shots. And then for later ones, they have to process there's gradually a way. So Exactly.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you.
Nothing like speech matters, maybe nothing like modal matters, nothing that is outside of language matters. And the reason we say this is simply because at the heart of the effect is, oh look, this happens for inflection. So any kind of more general factors that don't do justice to this distinction would be not able to explain the full pattern of results. That's kind of our take on it, because we think, yes, you'll probably be slower and maybe more or less influenced by RL1 or whatever. Maybe we're not as patient, maybe we've seen all these words less frequently. But you would expect the same pattern to appear for inflection and derivation. So we're kind of putting those on the side.
Oh, okay.
It's
It's just from my personal learning experience. Like, I'm a second language speaker, so I'm slower. Like,
yeah, exactly.
why doesn't that play a role?
Exactly. It might very well play a role. We just think that it would play the same role in inflection.
And derivation. Okay, I see the point.
And then because it doesn't,
Right.
but it could play a role with another mechanism that distinguishes inflection and derivation. So for instance, maybe derived forms are being decomposed and they're accessed in their bits by all, but inflected forms not. And then because of, say, differences in speed, etc., this might play a role in that inhibition effect. So you would need something else. And but you're right, it probably plays a role, because this thing is presented for 50 milliseconds.
Yeah, if they get a chance to everything, then
they don't see anything. I mean, they see something in the sense that inhibition is showing up. So it's also not, inhibition is showing up relatively to the control. So
and also to the control.
that's the thing. So it's not just the fact that something was there and that makes you slower.
He's inside.
It made you slower relatively to the control condition. And it's also not and it's also not the fact that they're similar in letters, because we didn't see the same effect in the orthographic condition. So whatever is happening is doing something. It's making lexical access more difficult. So walked is inhibiting walks, for instance. Or walked is inhibiting walk. Something like that. So it could be something like that. So walking inhibiting walked.
Yeah, another interesting thing about the structure that you selected. So the German past particle seems to have a.
But I have the.
Yes.
So every word, every past particle has a GE at the beginning. So that's actually the target.
That is very true. As in, maybe that is playing a role. And so our take on it was also something like, yeah, never mind the GE. That's only prosody, because the source of this thing is not really.
But when it comes to visual processing.
But when it comes to visual processing, you need to do something to it.
Yeah.
So what we tried to do, you see that needed, in a way, that needed to be there for two reasons. One is that there's lots of already priming studies conducted with participles, so we kind of wanted to take advantage of the fact that we already know that participles are processed in a certain way in general. Even it's besides the GE, etc., but we know that these things show a lot of combinatorial effects.
Right.
But the other one was length. See, that was kind of crucial. We needed the inflected prime and the derived prime to have exactly the same number of letters. Or else people would say, well, this one was shorter, so it was just processed faster. So we thought, okay, they need to have the same length. But that means that one needed to have a little G on the start and the other one.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
And what we tried to do was the control conditions. We tried to have that overlap.
Yeah, very carefully,
So that was one way of doing it. Was like when there is orthographic overlap, sometimes you put it in the middle of the word and sometimes in the beginning to match that difference, to see if that was playing the role. But it's not ideal. Yeah, it's not ideal. It would be nice doing this in English, with something like this. Imagine believer. There was actually a study like this, only it was done with natives like 15 years ago. So they haven't done this with non-native speakers, but there is a study in English which is like this, inflection and derivation coming the same target. And it's believer, and believed. And they're both priming belief. So you have belief, which is it's just a stem. It's completely contained within the prime.
Right.
You don't have to decompose anything in the target. It's primed by inflection or derivation, exactly the same number of letters. Even one of the letters is the same. It's very, very nice.
What did What did they
Um,
find?
They actually just found priming for everything.
Everything, including inflection?
But it's native speakers, so
Oh,
yes, that's
native
what you would
speakers.
expect. And then there is an ERP study, which I think uses the same thing, and they found kind of early effects in ERP wave for inflection and for derivation. But these people haven't done this with non-native speakers. So we're kind of combining everything. We're combining the inflection derivation priming with the L2 literature, and then we have the continuous effective
Yeah,
age of
yeah,
acquisition,
yeah.
and then we have the critical period, which
Yeah.
is putting it all
This is
together
very impressive.
in a big like cake.
And also the analysis that you did, I had never heard about those before the break.
So that regression with breakpoints, is there something similar to discontinuity regression?
But maybe it exists. There are like all sorts of types of regression.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, maybe, yeah.
The other day I heard about later regression and all sorts of stuff. So there's probably a regression for that. Probably. But so have you read like Bayern stuff and the statistical stuff? Anyway, Bayern has this book. Harold Bayern has this book called yeah, all the stuff about mixed effects and blah blah blah. And there he has a little page about regression and breakpoint. So that's where I thought, nice. I'll just use this for the critical period effect.
Yeah, that's yeah.
But then I found a paper done in 2013 where somebody had done breakpoints for critical period and saying this is the right way of doing it. I learned it in Bayern and I thought, me too.
Wow.
Such a shame I didn't publish this earlier.
Oh yeah, you should. So you're the first one. Yeah, that's yeah. So in the past, what we've read, they're just showing the scatter plots properly to show the pattern, right? And now you have statistical,
Exactly.
yeah, results, evidence
this-
for that.
descriptive.
Yeah.
This dude is called Van Hoeven. He published a paper in 2013 plus one.
Oh, I think I know that one. Yeah.
It's an open access.
It is. We can find the other one. I think I read articles from that.
It's this journal that is open access and they focus specifically on the math methodology. They don't reject your paper because the science is not important. They just want the paper to something like that. Anyway. But a lot of good papers here. Anyway. And this guy published this paper saying, look, we all have to do breakpoints. I know. But also because he said, I learned this from Bayern's book. So did I. But these are the measures of chromatic judgments, and these are what I can use a lot in the critical period literature. So for measures of processing,
That's very interesting.
this would be like the first time. And even for grammaticality judgments, there are some studies showing this, and some studies showing the other way around. So for instance, you have
Dr. DeCase's study, I think, showed this way.
I mean, not like that. That doesn't happen. What I mean is, for instance, in Johnson and Newport, you have this, and then in Birdsong and Wallace, with exactly the same materials, you have this.
Oh.
And then you look at them and you go, oh,
Right,
this
right.
is a bit inconsistent, especially because it's the same material. And then the other side came and said, oh, look, if I move the breakpoint 4 years ahead, then I don't find any difference anymore. This was all like 20 years ago, but still. People just find all these different shapes and inconsistent stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, That's the thing.
It also
Because
depends on the sample, right?
And they're different individuals speaking different languages.
Exactly.
Right.
They come from different L1s.
Yeah.
They're different people.
Right.
But also they do correlations instead of.
Yeah.
They assume the breakpoint sometimes it's 16, sometimes it's 20, sometimes
Yeah,
it's
they
whatever.
have the
Yeah.
Korean symptom.
Yeah.
So it's all a bit. But nevertheless, it's always very inconsistent. Like what we discussed